Right, Catherine?
Yes, and I don't wear jodhpurs.
What does that mean?
That means I don't actually go into the Sahara.
Oh,
I hunt big game in the urban jungle.
that's right, the urban jungle.
Okay.
And the urban, are we shooting?
Yeah, this
And
is
the
it.
urban jungle is the world of getting major accounts. In other words, big long-term contracts for my clients. Because my clients are usually smaller professional services or advisory firms. And that means, why bother with big game if you're a mid-sized firm? How can you go after the
big company.
Fortune 1000?
Yeah.
What I've realized is that smaller business owners who are professionals themselves, usually, if they want to sell their business, end up not having too many assets to sell and not really having much when it comes to the valuation and the price they're going to sell it for, really not getting the money that they would like to have for their business. Now here's why. The business is in their head. All the knowledge, all the contacts, all the customer information is often in their heads. And they also don't have bricks and mortar, so they have no other assets that traditionally anybody could say that's a value for. So having a couple of long-standing agreements in place for
Customers.
a services firm, yes.
Yeah, they can sell that and sell the clientele.
What it means is that there's predictable cash flow.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem when you're selling a services business is it's usually contract or, pardon me, it's contract or project based. So that means that there's a start and an end. They don't go on year over year generally. You come in for a special event in the life of that business and you're finished.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can become a preferred provider or a preferred vendor, in other words, you have been pre-approved by a large firm, you're the only specialty provider in that category for them, it means that year over year you will get repeat assignments. If you engineer it properly, you'll get repeat assignments inside of a large firm. And therefore when it's time to sell and the business owner leaves, the new owner says, oh, well, I don't have to start at zero. There's at least something I can depend upon
Mm-hmm.
when I've bought this business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they're buying some cash flow. They
That's
can
it.
project what their income's going to be over the next little bit.
Yes.
One of the issues that, because you're talking about smaller, medium-sized companies getting big corporate clients. One of the issues that I've heard small and medium-sized business people talk about is they don't want to have kind of all their eggs in one basket. They don't want to have just one big customer, or even taking on, if they've got a bunch of little customers and all of a sudden now they take on a big customer like that, it changes or can change the whole character of their business. Mm-hmm. And in the long run, I've heard some of these people say, I don't really want that one big customer that's gonna, because if they leave, then they upset the apple cart.
That's true. And I would give you the diversification advice, whether I was your financial advisor or whether I was your business development person. When I talk about becoming preferred provider inside of a large corporation, we think of, for instance, a big bank as one entity. In fact, it is an agglomeration of many different businesses. There might be as many as 30, 50 lines of business or P&Ls, profit and loss areas within a business. So what that means is that if you're in a big financial services brand, for instance, as a provider, you might have as many as 30 to 50 very discrete budgets that could buy your services. So I view that as diversification within the umbrella of risk reduction, because the small business absolutely has to guarantee that they don't have all of their cash flow and all of their assets going out the door if somebody defects. So there's a balance to be had inside of the business development process or methodology, which is part of what I leave behind. After my work is finished, I have taken the knowledge out of the owner's brain, put it into database, put it into methodology. I've watched where a business owner is the person who does the networking. They might have a couple people on staff. They've usually hired those salespeople for their Rolodex, for their contacts within the industry. That means they might have access. The difficulty there is that many salespeople are not that experienced inside of a large, complex decision-making process. If you're inside of a Fortune 1000 company, there might be as many as 20, 30 influencers in and around a decision.
Pete, that's giving me a headache right now. Putting myself in the position of a small to medium-sized person trying to access that bureaucracy, that is giving me a headache just thinking about all those hoops I have to jump through, all that bureaucracy that is going to be, that I have to work my way through to get that yes at the other end.
Then that's exactly why many small businesses don't do it, partly because there is a very clear difference between sales and business development. I've actually taken major account business development methodologies and principles, which all big accounts, a big pharma company, a big manufacturer, will have major account specialists on staff. Mm-hmm. I've scaled it back, but you can also see why I'm so popular with small and mid-sized firms, because it's true, most mid-sized firms don't take the risk of going after a big firm, a big company as a client, partly because they know it's going to be a long sales cycle and it's going to be complex. And if they haven't lived inside of that environment themselves, and many consultants, by the way, come out of large firms, so they have some notion of how a decision gets approved inside of a business, a large firm.
Some notion, but they're not often a sales type. They're a subject matter
Precisely.
expert. Yeah.
Precisely. And they don't like doing the sales and the business development and can be to them a smarmy experience. So when I work with business owners, I know that they are the subject matter experts. And in the process, the development process, which goes through many stages, if you think about a buying process for yourself, you don't wake up just one morning just because someone has knocked on your door with some new idea and say, well, yes, we should go out and see this. So it takes some time during the buying process, and I know that the business owner, being the subject matter expert, they should be in a situation where it's a peer-to-peer conversation. In other words, I do the rest of the, do you have the budget? Where might this fit in? What are the bigger business issues you might want to solve with this kind of a service when I'm acting on behalf of a client? But I'm able to then feature, after we go through that discovery exploration process with the people inside of a business who might be potential clients for the company I'm serving at that moment, that business owner will be most effective when they are meeting with somebody else who understands what they do. They don't want to be there talking about the high level, business climate issues. That's not what they're interested in doing. It's not where their strengths are. So matching them up at the right moment in the buying cycle, not the sales cycle, which is what we do, but the buying cycle on the other side of the table, matching that subject matter expert up with their in-house experts is where
that's where the magic happens.
Yes, but if you don't have the funding and you don't have a potential business problem that this consulting firm, for example, can help solve, there will be no further discussions. And if I don't eliminate all of that static and interference, the subject matter experts' conversations generally don't yield a contract.
That's really interesting. And you talk about the sales cycle and you talk about the buying cycle. And they're really kind of the same thing, but are you advocating that people who are selling forget about the sales cycle and start putting their minds in the mindset of their potential customers? In other words, think about the buying cycle of your potential client?
I'm glad you asked that question, because I have experienced a difference between the sales cycle, which is about where I want to be if I'm selling, and the messages I want to send. So that's a very me-oriented procedure. The difference between the sales cycle, and I need to know where we are, during that process, absolutely, or you won't bring the right materials and the right players to the table. But the buying cycle, by contrast, is what the psychology of the various individuals, because remember, this is a complex, not one individual saying a yes. There's a green light or a go, no go situation for each individual in and around that decision. So, for instance, there may be suppliers who would be affected if your firm were hired. They're an influencer. There may be in-house experts. If you're retained, would have to say, yeah, they're right, or what they do is appropriate here. So the buying cycle is not just a combination of the different individuals and where they are in saying yes, no, go, no go, but where the trajectory is overall toward the general movement towards a contract definition.
That's all very interesting, but you may have explained it before, but how do you find where all this is going to fit? Like, what would be an example?
Okay.
I suppose is what I want to say.
Of the buying cycle?
You're not a magician. You must be able to find, the buying cycle, where these individuals are. I've been in that boat. I've been in sales for an advertising group, and I get these guys, and there's all these other people involved, and then I find out someone down the line does not. It just doesn't fit, and it didn't work out right. So there may not be a perfect answer. It's just a service that you provide, obviously.
No, there is a science behind it, or it couldn't be replicated, and it couldn't be left behind. So when I made the claim earlier that I leave a methodology, a big game hunting or key account acquisition methodology behind, it means that I've been able to not only extract that knowledge from my own brain, but to teach others and then put it into a frame of reference. So, for example, you asked a very, very important question, which is, how do you find who those influencers are in an informal structure inside of a company? Because yes, you know who may be the check signer because they're the head of the line of business. But what you don't know is who those informal influencers in and around that decision will be. So here's how we find them. Here's how I've discovered you can find them.
This is gold.
It's a two-step process, and it very much follows the new politesse, I call it, inside of business, which is permission-based. It used to be that you could just push your way in, get someone's attention, and get your 3 minutes to tell them what you want or what you want to sell them. That's not how it works
And
anymore.
they bring everybody else in line, supposedly. That was the
Yeah,
original.
that's
that doesn't
changed.
work.
It has changed,
Yeah.
and I think one of the things that's done it is the internet, where we've come to acknowledge that people, when they give us permission, are more willing to listen to us. So the two things that I've learned to do, which are very counterintuitive to a traditional sales process, are these. The first is I develop what I call an executive briefing, which is it's very chunked up. In other words, it's if my client, for instance, offers a learning and development business, if they are specialists in learning and development, that's going to belong in the learning and development specialty groups within a large firm. However, if you want to get away from that level of the organization and go to the top, you have to design something that's very chunked up. In other words, how will learning and development relate to creating shareholder value? How will it relate to your capital requirements, for example? First is the executive briefing. That goes out with permission to the assistant, to the senior exec, who gives you the email and says, yes, I'd be happy to review that or have this person review it. So that's a permission-based piece, and it's a permission-based process.
So you send that.
Before you ask for an appointment.
Yeah.
You email it to the assistant of the person you really want to talk to?
You ask to the assistant,
Yes.
will they give you permission to email an executive briefing and that you want, if we're relevant, to arrange time for a conversation
And then you email that.
to the
Once you
assistant.
get the permission from the assistant, then you email the executive briefing
Assistant.
to the assistant.
That's right.
And then they will review it and or forward it to the,
To the executive. Yes. Yes.
all right?
So that's a bit, traditional sales process would say, don't bother wasting your time with the assistant. What we understand is that the assistant, if we think of them as a gatekeeper, and some do,
They're a problem to be overcome, right? Rather than
How-
a
yes,
help in the process.
that's right. Because their job is not to make the decision as to whether or not that senior exec is going to have a meeting with you, but their job is to get the information to that person so that they can make that decision with information.
So the executive briefing, what is that, like a one page? You want to keep it short, right?
It's an email that is a couple bullets around the message of the benefits to that level of the organization.
Which you're imagining, because you don't really know what their real issues are.
You would expect to have done a lot of research.
Okay.
So the science is understanding the industry and the big industry trends.
And that's what you have.
Yes.
You help to give them a process through which they can get that
I
level of
create it.
understanding, right?
In many cases, I am retained to create it.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is a kind of thinking that has not usually taken place. Even the business owner who's a subject matter expert will tend to tell the story in a sales environment, will tend to tell the story in terms of the features and benefits of that service. They are less prepared to tell the story to the benefits, which are different at a different level in the organization.
Mm-hmm.
So that translation is based upon the knowledge of the industry, and the document is often a very high-level PDF, whatever, as an attachment, and that is a combination based on often neurolinguistic principles of language that is weighted inside of the frame of reference of that level of an organization, and some less conscious imagery that takes them towards the movement, because a movement towards a decision to say, yes, I need to explore this. So what you build into it is, what are the usual objections that you'd hear? So you head them off. Why should it not go? Here's the usual objections. Why does it not belong down at another area in my organization? It's some area of administrations or operation. That would be one objection we readily have to head off.
Do you outline the objections and
No.
then provide the solutions, or do you just provide those answers?
You provide those answers. Now, here's an example. I just created one of these for a client who has had a lot of success in financial services industry. And what one page, if I'm remembering this correctly, the service offering is a leadership development simulation experiential role play type of environment where you have a real business challenge that you're working through. So often that service in the mind of the buyer is thought to be either you're using simulation or avatars, because there's a lot of that now happens.
That's cool, avatars.
Yes. But when you say the word role play to somebody, the other thought that comes to mind is, oh yeah, I've been in those training programs where my colleague pretends to be so and so, and it's not a real experience. Well, there are 3 statements in the one slide for this business that just says, we are not avatars, classroom pretend, or I've forgotten what the third thing is. So to answer your question, it's very, very concise, knowing what the usual perceptions are on the other side of the table.
It's you mentioned neurolinguistics. Now that is in terms of how you write this document, this executive briefing. And I'm not even sure what that means. I mean, I'm a writer, and I like to think I can write some good marketing copy, and I can get through to people, but I don't understand. What does that mean? The neural link, is it? Do you have to study some science before you can write this stuff, or?
Well, I should tell you that my background is the arts. I studied literature. I did a couple degrees in comparative Canadian literature in the days before that was really very mainstream. And is it any wonder I never ended up with a permanent assignment teaching in a university? I was ahead of my time on the trend. I didn't understand that until later, until I started learning a bit about business. But to answer your question about neurolinguistics, it is the connections that our brain, our conscious mind makes between concepts, which can be language or imagery, and the unconscious content of it. So for example, when I say to you towards rather than away from, you would expect that my unconscious mind generally is somebody who prefers a towards message. So if you were marketing to me, you wouldn't talk about risk. If you were marketing to me, you'd talk about things that I could have in the future. So there are clues inside of language and imagery. I used semiotics as a critical methodology for literature when I was in school, in my grad program. So I was a little familiar with it, but I've also done some certification so that I can learn more about it, because yes, it is a science. It comes out of quantum physics.
Quantum physics?
Yes, because our neural pathways are just electrical charges. And we can change them. We can, by some consciousness and some tools, which anybody could learn. Tony Robbins, for instance, has done a lot of work teaching people
the brain
things.
that heals itself. I know Norman, was it Deutsch is
Yes.
a professor. You've heard of the book.
Yes.
So neuroplasticity, same idea, I guess.
It
That's
is.
what, yeah.
That's precisely it.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
It's,
I'm still fascinated.
there's opportunity, lots of opportunity.
Sounds like something though a person might be able to have a natural feel of how to communicate that way, not necessarily.
Well, I
needing to
thought I
study it,
did.
but yeah.
You know.
Yes. Okay.
But when I started doing, I'm an American board certified neurolinguistic practitioner at a master's level, and I did that so that I could be better at the work I do now. I thought I was pretty smart and pretty well educated when it came to language,
Okay, wait a sec. I've got
but
this.
I needed.
Okay, wait, because I have this thing about, well, a document I presume you wrote about you,
Yes.
right? Did you use some of this neurolinguistic stuff in this document right here?
Yeah, I know. I'm very scary in personal relationships. People think I can read their minds.
Really? Uh-oh.
No, you get general frames of reference. One of the things you've noticed is when you talk to somebody, you ask them a question, for example, you might say, now that's an interesting watch. Where did you find that?
Oh.
Oh, funny she should mention the watch, eh, Dan?
I found it on the internet.
Great. Now, one of the things that happened, I noticed happening, I've been trained to watch for this, is where your eyes went to access that information. So what I watched was they went this
Yeah.
way, which means the auditory or listening part, and then you went to experience, which is the kinesthetic part.
Yeah.
So you see, it's not really ooga booga. It's really once you know what to look for and what to watch and how to use that again. So if I were asking you to make a decision, for example, I would know that I would say to you, now this is going to sound like something you've already heard about, and it's going to feel really good because I've used sound, auditory, and then feel, kinesthetic,
Yeah.
inside of your frame of reference, because I know that's the order. By watching your eyes, I know that's the order in which you access and process information. So that's your preference. So the reason I studied it was so that I could pick up things like that, because I do all my work over the phone. I reach out primarily to the large financial institutions in the US on behalf of my clients, and therefore I don't have any visual references. I can't see somebody else's eyes if I'm on the phone with them.
Yeah.
But I have to quickly understand, through their use of language, tonality, pace, etc. I need to have those clues if I'm going to successfully engage in a phone conversation that says yes, no, or a referral as an outcome. I want to influence the outcomes towards referrals as opposed to no's.
Is this a more organized version of someone that's got tremendous intuition to be able to accomplish the same thing as you in a way? I'm not sure.
That's a great question, because one of the things I've learned as I've started to study this is our unconscious mind, or intuition, which runs our body, our memories, and our emotions. Our unconscious mind can process 2 million bits of information a second, whereas our conscious mind can only process 126 bits of information a second.
That's our RAM.
That's right. It's exactly like a computer program.
Yeah.
That's right. So where do you think the better information, the better data is? In memory and feeling. And that's our unconscious mind. So when we talk about intuition, once we get that connection, and we have a few things that we watch for and use consciously, then we are actually using the intelligence of our neurology, which is primarily our unconscious mind and our intuitions.
Actually, to rephrase it, you're probably using a lot of, from your experience, a lot of intuition with technique that you've learned.
Yes, I'd agree with
technique.
that if I am much better at applying my intuition now that I've been trained.
Yeah, okay.
As with anything. You know, I might be
better
a natural.
articulated than what I said, okay.
And more
Yeah.
consciously. So when I say methodology, for instance, in the buying cycle, and we started down this pathway as you were asking me, how did I actually know where to go in the organization to find all those influencers?
Yeah.
And you also asked, then how do you know where they are in
Yeah.
each of their individual
Right.
buying processes?
Yeah.
So part of it is paying attention to that. Part of it's building a really good database, making sure that all that information is captured. Not that in the moment with somebody on the phone, you don't use your intuition, but you also have to prepare. So for instance, if I'm doing a discovery conversation, which is what I call the next stage. So the executive has received the briefing. They've said, yes, we are actually thinking about this particular business problem that you've mentioned.
Right.
And then we book a meeting either with that executive or with someone on their team. And then 7 out of 10 times, the executive who receives the briefing refers to somebody on their team, which says a green light to, yes, we're worried and thinking about this particular business issue, and B, here's the person on my team who's the lead. So in that discovery conversation, you come prepared. You're not there to tell your sales story. That's a very traditional idea. And again, the internet and teaching us about being polite, and at a cocktail conversation, we wouldn't talk about ourselves all the time. So that's what happens now in sophisticated sales settings and business development. So the person you're meeting with, you've prepared some high gain questions, and those questions are based on business intelligence you've gathered through your research. You're a writer, so you know if you're writing for a purpose and an audience, you can't take a risk because you don't have a lot of time, and you have to be precise to get to the outcome you want after 15 or 20 minutes. So the preparation of a high gain question is often going and listening to the webcast, podcast, earnings reports, investor relations stuff, which for a public company is all really available. So you can listen to the most senior executives' statements of priorities in their reports to shareholders, in public statements, and you can have a pretty good idea of what those priorities are, so that when you're talking to that individual in a discovery environment, to say, how is the company thinking about things like customer experience? I noticed that, and you mentioned what your research turns up, and then you can segue into, oh, so have you thought about this possibility to reach a solution? So it's a co-creation as opposed to here's something better and great, do you want it or not?
Right.
And of course, they're flattered that you did that, and whoever you're seeing, that person that's the lead of that particular area, and says, well, actually, that you got that, but not only that, there's this, and then you get more information that you want to get from him or her.
And out of that comes who else is involved.
Yeah.
You can ask the
Yeah.
question directly,
Yeah.
or quite often it will come up. It will be, well, I don't really make that decision on my own.
Yeah.
Our group of X, Y, and Z, and then you ask permission to go and speak to them. So it becomes a chain with permission
Yeah.
and with a series of green lights, just as if you were going to Hollywood with your script that you needed to get approved. You got to get a series of green lights.
I think a lot of the everyday, I know this is for a specific business area, but I think a lot of people could take advantage of some of these suggestions. And
Well,
ideas.
it's
We want to know when your book's coming out.
Are you going to write a book?
Well, you'd think that somebody with a literature background should write a book. I did write the unpublished novel. It's still under the bed. I mean, anybody.
What's it called? What's it called?
It's called Parallax. And you can tell that I was way too deep into semiotics for that to be a bestseller.
Whoa. Well, you
Yeah,
never
I
know.
was a geek.
Yeah. I mean, I think your competence comes across big time. A lot of the stuff you're talking about is new. I mean, probably is new to a lot of people who are in business. They maybe haven't thought of things this thoroughly, or that there's an actual science that they can apply to the sales process like this. And there's stuff I'd like to keep talking about, but we don't have a lot of time left, like your theory, big game hunters in the urban jungle and that sort of thing.
How
So
appropriate, actually.
we're just about out of time, but I want to ask you just to be very clear, like who should think about giving you a call and getting all this to work for their businesses?
I love that question. Thanks. The business owners of professional services, consulting firms, advisory firms who have a good practice, they suspect they're going to want to sell, and they want to plan now for getting the most out of that business when it's ready to sell.
Plus, maybe they're very ambitious and they want to take their small or medium-sized company and become a very big company, and they want to play with the big boys, and they need to figure out how to do that, right?
Yes, growth, planning for growth and avoiding those feast or famine revenue cycles is, that's the bane of the existence of a smaller business owner as well, because when you're delivering the solution, you're the expert, you're usually leading the team, you don't have the time to do the business development. And that's a continuity that has to be there. You can't just pick it up and drop it, because who knows what's happened inside of that industry or inside of those companies you've been pursuing during the time you're delivering the work.
So can people go to your website and make contact there, find out a little bit more?
Absolutely, yes. It's www.huntnewbiz, HUNTNEWBIZ.com. Hunt New Biz. And my name is Catherine McQuaid.
I